Thank you very much for joining us for our Cyber Perspective session on software security. My name is Stephen Lilly, and I'm a partner in Mayor Brown's cybersecurity and data privacy practice. I'm really pleased to be joined today by three experts in this field who have kindly agreed to share their perspectives on what companies can do to manage the legal risks associated with threats to software security. Aaron Cooper is Vice President Global Policy at BSA, which is the leading advocate for the global software industry before governments and in the international marketplace. In this role, Aaron leads BSA's global policy team and contributes to the advancement of BSA's members' policy priorities around the world that affect the development of emerging technologies, including data privacy, cybersecurity, AI regulation, data flows, and digital trade. Maria Garzaro is VP Legal Product at Aveva, which is a global leader in industrial software that is relied upon by over 90% of leading companies in 12 industrial sectors. In her role, Maria has responsibility for cybersecurity, privacy, and all other relevant legal questions related to Aveva's sophisticated and critical software products. Sam Kaplan serves as Director and Senior Global Policy Counsel at Palo Alto Networks, where his responsibilities include global cybersecurity law, critical infrastructure protection, privacy and data security, and public-private capacity building. Before transitioning to the private sector, Sam served as the Assistant Secretary for Cyber Infrastructure Risk and Resilience Policy at the US Department of Homeland Security, as well as the department's Chief Privacy Officer. Thank you all very much for participating in our session today. I know that everyone's going to really benefit from your fantastic insights. So the security of software has obviously been critical for a very long time to cybersecurity. While by no means the only way that systems can be compromised, vulnerabilities in the software itself can lead to exploitation by hackers and have always been a source of concern for cybersecurity teams. That said, my sense is that in the past 10, 15 years, other priority issues have had a higher sort of significance from a legal perspective than software security, whether it's breach notification or substantive standards or procedural standards that need to be met by owners and operators of systems in various sectors. But there has been, I think, in the last 12 months, 2 years, a particular focus on software security with the Biden administration. We've seen a big increase in attention, for example, to vulnerability management programs, including with respect to coordinated disclosure and bug bounty. We've also seen heightened emphasis on maintaining secure software development practices. It's this latter piece in particular that has seen a pronounced spike in attention during the Biden administration. So to start off the conversation, I really want to kind of get your perspective on why software security? Why is it sort of having what feels like a moment now? Why is it suddenly sort of such a particular focus for the Biden administration? And whether through the executive order or through other actions that it's taken. And maybe Aaron, I'll start with you. Why is software security such a priority right now?
Sure. Well, first, thanks very much for having me on. I had the pleasure of working with Stephen on Senate Judiciary and now as a client, and the strategic vision that you bring is something that is really helpful, especially as we're grappling with these emerging issues. On the specific question, I think I'd put it into 4 buckets. I think, first of all, there's an increased recognition that companies in all different economic sectors are going through digital transformation that's relying on software. And while that software is making them more resilient, improving safety, improving operations, it also increases the attack vectors. And one of the things that I think there's an increasing recognition of is the need to make sure that software is both developed and maintained in a secure way because of how it's affecting all economic sectors. The second would be national security. The executive order that you're talking about is, of course, directly related to procurement. Just as industry is going through digital transformation, so is the government. Of course, we never think they're doing it as quickly as they should, but it's definitely a priority. And as they're doing that, making sure that the software that they procure is developed and maintained in a secure way is important. The third is the high-profile intrusions that have happened, particularly on government networks. And as we all know, when it becomes a high-profile event, there's going to be a response from the government, and I think that's part of what we're seeing. And the fourth, and probably the most important, is that for so long, government, both in the US, but also around the world, really haven't focused on this issue as much as perhaps they should. And I think when the Biden administration came in, they recognized that. We put together, starting back in 2017, the software security framework that went through the entire life cycle of developing and secure capabilities and secure life cycle of software. And we put that together in part because we didn't see frameworks like that being used by governments yet. Now, NIST has a software security development framework that they've come out with, and I think that is really helpful. But I think the White House saw that there was a gap there, and I think wanted to fix that as quickly as possible.
That's really interesting. You mentioned the work that you did in putting the framework together, the lack of sort of other frameworks. Now, like you said, post EO, there has been the SSDF has come out, and there are these sort of government frameworks. Maybe sort of a question for you, Sam, from your perspective. I mean, obviously, Palo Alto Networks make some very sophisticated software and produce some very sophisticated software, and you do business with lots of folks all over the economy. As you think about sort of these, where we are now, where we were 5 years ago, the way the industry has sort of, done a lot of this legwork, and now the government, to some extent, feels like it's catching up. Is that a reflection of the complexity of the challenges associated with software security? The sort of, and I guess the risks associated with doing it wrong, in the sense that if you had an overly prescriptive regime, you might dampen innovation, or you might point people down the wrong path. What sort of is complexity part of the issue here that's sort of driving that where we find ourselves and the reaction to where we find ourselves? I think you may be on mute.
I think it's probably multifaceted. And again, Stephen, thanks to Mayor Brown for inviting myself to participate in this discussion today. It's been fabulous working with the firm, and this is an important issue. To your particular question, I think, the question about sort of complexity, or if there was a recognition, like Aaron was talking about, that this is sort of a big gap in sort of the more holistic approach to sort of increasing cyber resilience across systems. I think, that in addressing both of those areas, I think it really reflects that it's both of those issues that can be true in this area. The software security can be a particularly challenging area, both from a technical perspective, but also from a policy perspective. I mean, really being able to sort of thread that needle and find the balance between not being too prescriptive. And I think, that's one of the real advantages of the executive order, and especially in Section 4, where they were directing NIST to sort of develop those frameworks, and for both software security, but also the supply chain frameworks that were sort of associated with that, as sort of the fundamental sort of first tranche efforts that they're doing underneath the executive order really reflect that, that the complexity and the policy that needs to map on top of that complexity does need a little bit of flexibility to sort of engender itself through that ecosystem. Like it's recognized, and you really see that in sort of the structure of that NIST, SSDF, the Secure Software Development Framework. I mean, where it's really providing that guidance, that broader guidance for organizations that allows them to look for all aspects of software security, because it really does touch each one of those. That's ensuring, the people and processes and the technology are ready to execute those secure software development plans, that the software and the product itself, the components, are protected from tampering and unauthorized access, to the actual production cycles, to sort of minimize the vulnerabilities that are either developed or included into those softwares. And then, how organizations themselves should really respond to that. So when you talk about complexity, I mean, this is a really multifaceted area, and sort of the policy does need to sort of hit these sub-policy areas that sort of factor into that. And like Aaron was talking about, that pressing need, I think, there's real reflection in the EO that software security was in there in Section 4, like up there with, threat information sharing, which we've been talking about in the cybersecurity community for decades now. This is, sort of a recognized need, that this is a real pressing requirement that policymakers really want to start moving forward with. So I think it's really both of those aspects.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And so you're talking about sort of technical pieces, policy pieces. And I think once you have policy pronounced, then those become legal issues as well. And whether that's through the executive order, or other sort of policy actions, or sort of risk of litigation, or what have you. I guess sort of the premise of this session is that software security is a legal issue. It's not just a technical issue, but it's a legal issue as well. And I'd love to get Maria your thoughts on that. I mean, your product is your responsibility. You're a software company. This is this is obviously something you think a ton about. It's like, why is this a legal issue at this point? Like what, and what are how does that sort of maybe in your day-to-day life, like what are things you're thinking about in terms of this being a legal issue?
Yeah, well, so first of all, thanks for having me, Stephen. But to answer your specific question, I mean, if you are a vendor right now in the software space and you're talking about industrial data, you're a vendor to the government, you're a vendor to government contractors, you're a vendor to critical infrastructure. All of a sudden, these are all contract issues, right? Because everything coming out of these EOs are being flown down to the contracts that are then being put into checklists that are then imposed upon you as a vendor. So, you as a software vendor who are maybe not directly regulated, all of these regulatory issues are now your problem. Either directly through contract or just because you want to be attractive to the government as a supplier. So other than it being a contract and regulatory issue that you need to be on top of, I think that caring about security in your software becomes more of a fundamental issue of caring that your software works, right? Because your software working and it being secure are completely interrelated regardless of who you are supplying your software to. All of that kind of bundled into one, all of a sudden it becomes your day-to-day issue.
Yeah, I mean, that raises a bunch of really interesting questions. I mean, you're clearly talking about best practices that you have in place that could be models for lots of other companies. I mean, a little later, we'll talk about what companies who maybe aren't as sophisticated as you might be able to do and still do software development, but that's a really helpful insight. And what you touched on too is, you're a software developer and a vendor. Obviously, there's a flip side of this, which is a customer who's buying this, and that's something that lots of folks think about as well from the other side. But to your point, it sounds like at the end of the day, these requirements are all being flown down one way or another. And yeah, it's all very interesting. So, I mean, we were talking about the Biden executive order. Before this session, I went through and I pulled out all the pieces that related to software security. And I had a list and I was like, oh, it'd be great. I could just highlight a few of these pieces, but the list is so long. I mean, there are so many pieces in the executive order, from defining critical software to the SBOMs, to some of the sections that you all already highlighted. I won't try to give a dramatic reading of the EO, but just to highlight that, like everyone said, it is such an important sort of document and direction, and it really just elevates this issue. And maybe from that perspective, maybe I'll start with you, Aaron. Which of the pieces of the EO, I mean, maybe you can't, maybe it's hard to choose among them, but are there one or two pieces of the EO that, from a software security perspective, seem most likely to sort of have like an enduring impact? Whether within directly, as you said, government procurement, or more broadly across the economy?
Yeah, I think several of them, because of what Maria was saying about how it starts in government contracts, and that's the direct requirement, but it's going to impact the way it works in the private sector as well, and what customers are expecting to be able to see from a software vendor, software developer. I think that the NIST doing their SSDF 1.1, so the next iteration of their software security development framework that took what they had originally done and added to it some of the other requirements from the EO. I think that's I think the keystone of what the EO was trying to get at. And I think that going to Sam's point, what's been really constructive about it is that it's a flexible framework and that it's risk-based. So if it's overly prescriptive, it's going to be more of a checkbox exercise, and it's not going to be effective probably in the short term, and certainly wouldn't be effective in the long term. Things that we would have thought of a decade ago as important on software security or cybersecurity generally are outdated by now, but the risk management framework can endure for much longer. And I think that kind of flexible approach that also helps the government from their procurement officers, and similarly in the private sector, communicate with vendors about the security posture of the development cycle, of the capabilities of the software, and so on. I think that can be really helpful in ultimately down the road making transactions more efficient, both from a government sales perspective as well as in the private sector, because those questions are going to come to software developers regardless of whether this EO would come out. But now there's a solid framework to start using as a way of communicating back and forth.
Yeah, I didn't think of this question before the session, so apologies to put you on the spot, Aaron. But I guess the tenor of your comments, it strikes me that you seem, I mean, obviously there are obviously imperfections in anything, and nothing's ideal, and there's always a chance to improve stuff. But would you say, just generally speaking, whether it's the SSDF or other elements of what's come out of the EO, that there is a lot of sort of positives and sort of thoughtful? I mean, it seems like there was industry collaboration. I mean, obviously, a lot of times there's a collaboration, but not every comment gets reflected in the final version. But like, whether you grade something, also just give a general sense. Like, do you think it's all generally heading in the right direction, or as much as you could hope it to from where it's been?
I mean, certainly we think they should have taken BSA's software security framework and plopped it down in this, but they map to each other. And what I think is really good about that is, well, obviously it's not identical. When we went to companies, to our members, and said, let's talk about what secure development, what secure capabilities, what secure lifecycle should look like, and try to extract best practices, what we were trying to do is say, if you're like companies that we have here and you really care about security and you are developing in a secure way, what's the right way to do it so that we can lift the entire ecosystem? Because it's not enough just for all of our companies to develop and maintain software in a secure way. The least common denominator is a problem, and we need to lift everything. And I think that's what is really helpful about the NIST SSDF and the revised version of it, and will be important through the procurement process as well, is lifting everybody to those best practices.
That's great. I mean, and Maria's, I think, already mentioned, so the idea this is going to flow down is obviously going to become directly relevant to companies that sell to the government, but the expectation is that it, sort of standards or elements of it will sort of flow through contracts to other entities outside of sort of direct government procurement, which certainly makes sense to me as sort of what the path would be. But maybe, Sam, I'm going to maybe put you on the spot, if it's okay, with probably an impossible question, a prediction. Do you think that this is a tool that will, could be imposed, sort of in a sort of a mandatory way through other tools? Is this something you think we'll see in regulation, or even beyond the sort of the government contract space? Or do you think that do you sort of share Maria's view? I mean, certainly that it will be, that it would be pushed out through contract, through private parties, or do you think there's going to be some other extra sort of way that this will reach out to financial services sector or whoever it may be who doesn't necessarily do direct business with the government? And I think
it's a great question, Stephen. And I think we've seen this in other areas before, that where these sort of NIST publications, and I full-heartedly agree with sort of Aaron's points that he made about the secure software development framework, and I do think that there's just a real fundamental good exercise, like even when you look at a very discrete piece like defining what is critical software, like even getting organizations that don't have to wrestle with those questions to sort of do that broader risk analysis and say what pieces of sort of this machine are critical, that if they have a vulnerability, like they disrupt sort of further operations of the business. Like these are all just good fundamental exercises that organizations can start wrestling with regard to sort of the contractual requirements. I think what we've seen is that, executive orders come out, NIST puts out these special publications that obviously more directly applicably apply to people doing business with the federal government. These sort of obligations just sort of metastasize into sort of just widely held industry standards. I think, both in two ways. There, the processes that NIST undertakes to really put those developments with so much industry input, they do really reflect sort of the state of the art with regard to the policymaking and what's within the realm of possible, and the state of thinking that companies are looking at with respect to these organizations. So I think they do have a tendency to really reflect sort of best practices with the flexibility that's in the system right now. I think there's also sort of a chaining of obligations that just sort of naturally happens, while particular organizations may be the ones doing direct negotiations, contract negotiations in business with the federal government. As these tend to incorporate it, there's suppliers and sub-processors, and all of a sudden these sort of obligations and as they're incorporated as best practices, do tend to sort of chain out through a contracting stream. And pretty soon, like entire industries and organizations that aren't necessarily doing direct business with the federal government are looking at these types of obligations. But I think it's, it's NIST's process. And we've seen this in other areas, like with respect to the cybersecurity framework, the privacy frameworks, where these NIST publications, while there's no sort of stick that they have with regard to the broader industry, they often do get incorporated as sort of best practices that then organizations tend to incorporate and sort of indoctrinate, which, like we've been talking about here, just raises the water level. So all boats tend to rise as these standards rise.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, sorry.
Can I have one thing on top of that? I think one other area where the standards, the NIST frameworks can become really important is we've seen like in Europe, NISA has talked about putting together duty of care, what is due diligence on developing software. And I think that these types of frameworks that do draw from best practices start to fill in that gap of what is due diligence and duty of care in developing software.
That makes a lot of sense. And maybe I'll dive into one particular topic that was sort of addressed through EO and subsequent implementation. Everyone's favorite mouthful of an acronym, SBOMs. Maria, maybe I'll ask this question to you. I know that, we talked before, this panel is frankly a little bit skewed towards people who are, work with companies who are sort of expert in a lot of these things. So I think, you're maybe a little bit, far ahead of a lot of people who face some of these challenges. But, SBOMs are an idea essentially, so you can sort of an ingredient list for software, so you can understand what's in it. If there are vulnerabilities that are discovered in component pieces, you can quickly identify potentially affected software. This has been an idea that's been worked on for a long period of time. It was viewed as very, very hard, hard nut to crack, but there's been real progress, including under the executive order. I know that Aveva, just looking on your website, you talk about a lot of the great work you do around SBOMs, including, to look up, open source components and what have you. Maybe, Maria, a question for you is, what is, maybe there's the state of the art. What's the state of the art? Like, what's the sort of the art of the possible right now with respect to SBOMs? And what's your sense of where sort of industry as a whole may be, and what some of those challenges may be for folks who maybe haven't quite gotten to, to that level quite yet?
Yeah, so I know that the US government has adopted SPDX as their preferred SBOM, right? And frankly, like if you do any kind of Google search even on like what an SBOM is and what the standards are, SPDX is by far the most common right now. And it's great in that it's compatible with vendor solutions like Mend, formerly WhiteSource, and Black Duck. Right, so you plug it into the vendor solution, you scan all your software, boom. Like you can generate an SBOM. Like all of this has been built out so that it should be fairly painless to kind of do these things now. The problem is implementation, right? Like rolling out Black Duck or Mend into an organization that has thousands, millions of lines of code, it's a challenge. There are also difficulties around training. What do these hits mean? How do you identify a false positive? How do you take it out? How do you remediate that? What do you put in your backlog? There are challenges. It's difficult to roll out, but the tools, they exist. They're there. And I do see this as becoming more widely adopted. And I think it's great. We've been talking a lot about these software development frameworks and knowing your vendor and kind of like knowing your supply chain. And this is going to be a key component of that, right? So like you're going to get a piece of software, a library component that you want to implement into your final product. Great. Let me see the SBOM. Let me see what's in there so that I know that it's the latest and greatest, that it's been updated, and that it's secure. So this is one of those things that I think that's been going to be flowing down to the private sector that I think is going to lift everyone up. It's going to make everything better. There will be challenges in rolling it out, but once it's out there, I think it's going to be great. And frankly, there are a lot of open source license types out there that require something like this already. So the hope is that everyone has a kind of baseline that they can then build on in order to comply with these SBOMs.
So it sounds like in your mind at this point, I mean, there was a time, I think, where people couldn't really agree what an SBOM was or how to put it together. But, there was a lot of work done, by Alan Friedman and others within the administration. And, it's now there's sort of the minimum elements of document and what have you. It sounds like in your mind, those sort of fundamental questions essentially have been settled. And really now it's just a question of how to implement it, everyone knows what it is, everyone knows generally how to put it together. And the question now is just how to do it in the context of your own business. Is that sort of fair where you think sort of the state of the market is?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, at least from what I've seen, internally and from some of my colleagues, I would say that that's accurate. And if you look at the SPDX standard, I think it has become popular because it kind of lines up with what a lot of these open source licenses require already.
Great. Maybe a question for Sam. I know that Palo Networks does a lot of work around SBOMs as well. I mean, I think it wasn't that long ago. I think that some of if you sort of listened into the various working sessions and stuff, there were conversations around, SBOMs are a sort of a roadmap to attacking software because it tells you what's in there, and then people will be able to figure out how to exploit, vulnerable components or what have you. Does it feel, I mean, I know you track some of these policy issues really closely. Does it feel like those kind of policy issues have been settled at this point, or that there's been some resolution of sort of the path forward on this or other sort of related topics?
I mean, I think as like Marie was saying, I think there's some, with regard to the policy discussions and, things that are coming out of the executive order, or even some of the OMB directives or directives out of the Department of Commerce, like form and format, I think there is sort of a live policy discussion as to, I mean, there's definitely a recognition within the policy discussions that there is a value to having this with critical software components, like understanding what vulnerabilities are impacting who and what sectors. I think is just an important thing to understand. There's always that sort of threat vector. So being able to do this in sort of, protective manner where you're protecting sort of the information, not to mention like any intellectual property that may be a part of these sort of software development tools, so companies can continue to sort of develop and innovate. These are all sort of multifaceted processes that do need to be balanced when it comes to SBOM. But I think, like Palo Alto, there are capabilities out there that have the ability to sort of, put these things together to like look at all the libraries and versions to include open source, but again, striking that balance between what the technology can do and what the policy can is sort of a live discussion. And frankly, I think it should be a discussion that we should continue to sort of engage in, those doing business with government and those across industries, to tell you the truth.
And
that's great.
And I think part of that discussion needs to also include making sure that there's consistency both across government and internationally on what is ultimately going to be the SBOM. So just as a couple quick examples, in addition to what came out in the executive order, there are proposals for DoD to have a separate SBOM. In Europe, the Cyber Resilience Act is going to require an SBOM. And if those can all work together, and that's great, those could also end up being at odds with each other, and that's less great. And SBOM is just an easy way of illustrating the importance of interoperability and consistency, both across the same government and internationally.
So do you think it's fair to say then, just from imagine sitting, for anyone in the audience who's an in-house counsel working on sort of software related issues, that this is an expectation that's going to be, broadly applicable very soon, if not already? There'll be some general expectations, but there will be some challenges from a legal perspective in-house to sort of work through what's sort of possible, how to provide the information, how to protect the information, and that is going to be raise some interesting questions, I guess, for in-house counsel. Is that a fair prediction for the next couple of years?
Yeah, I think that's right. And as Aaron points out too, there's going to be sort of competing regimes, and in the cyber world, like that's not unique to SBOMs. I mean, we've seen that with other incident reporting with privacy regimes. It's for in-house counsel and the lawyers that are wrestling with these issues. You really have to sort of develop the ability to play three-sided chess with one of these to understand reporting requirements and what gets mapped where. But I would think that that's probably an accurate prediction.
Awesome. Well, I'm going to sort of pivot a little bit to talking about internal governance. So this is something there was discussion about, secure development life cycles, and sort of, I think Maria mentioned some of these other sort of governance tools. Maybe to start with you, Maria, what are the, maybe just to back up, in terms of legal risk management, one of the tools we often use, is policies and procedures. So we sort of have visibility into and predictability about how things are done, and then we have a defendable process if there's ever sort of a legal issue that arises. In sort of this realm, with respect to ensuring software security, what are some of the key policies and procedures that you would say companies that are doing software development should have in place?
Yeah, so I think, first of all, like you said, right, you have to have the policies, you have to have them documented, but then those have to actually lead into real processes. And those processes require a lot of training, right? So you need those three components. You need the policy, the process, and the training. And you need to stress test it fairly often to ensure that it's actually working, and that it stays fresh. And then if you're talking about like specific policies and procedures that I think are key, one that we've kind of touched on quite a bit here is the whole know your vendor process, right? You need to know who your vendors are. You need to understand your supply chain. And that goes everywhere from knowing, like, if you're using cloud, like where are you housing your source code? Like where is it being housed geographically? What kind of security is your vendor providing, all the way through to like what third-party tools are in your actual software. So that goes towards the SBOM. All the way to, if you are a cloud provider, like knowing your public cloud, like what are the security standards, what are their uptimes, all of that, right? So know your vendor. I think if you're looking at the very start of the development of your product, you also need documentation and policies around what's your design process, right? Document your design process, document who's making the decisions and when. You also need to have really tight policies and processes around who's accessing your source code, right? Who's accessing it, when, and why, and having some kind of audit so that you can then go back to ensure, that it's working and you understand who is accessing the source code and, again, why. You need processes around actually testing the security of your software, right? So you need tools to scan your software. You need processes around pen testing. Maybe you participate in bug bounty programs. I think those are like very high level. Those are probably like the most important processes and policies to keep in mind. But again, all of this is really kind of following the software development frameworks that are being developed by NIST. So like it all leads back to the government, because again, it's like maybe you're not a vendor to the government, but someone that you're supplying to is, and backwards. So it flows back and forth.
That's awesome. Maybe just sort of to kind of like flip the governance question. I mean, that was, you're talking about policies and procedures that govern the sort of the operations and the actual work being done. Maybe Sam, a question to you is, if you're an executive or you're in the legal department and you're overseeing software development, which I think can be a slightly daunting prospect given the sort of technical sophistication, the sometimes foreign language, and other sorts of potentially even sort of cultural barriers between the sort of the culture of a development team, which is sort of can tend to be fast and innovative, and the sort of the legal or the oversight team, which may have sort of like a different mindset to some extent. What are good tools, or how would you think about sort of that top level, that oversight down, to make sure that's what's supposed to be happening is happening?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and I think organizations do have that sort of those competing sort of interests across. From a leadership perspective, I think I have always felt that an issue, especially like software development, like visibility for in-house counsel or leadership, and it's in-house counsel and the attorneys giving that sort of visibility to the executive leadership as to how all encompassing this issue can be. I mean, it's a real 360 view of sort of processes and fundamental capabilities that they're deploying onto these systems. So giving that visibility, having the discussions around sort of the legal and regulatory issues that can be involved here. There are sort of executive decision points about that we've highlighted through here, especially with regard to sort of like the composition and details of SBOMs, and we need to consider sort of company interests and then the security interests. The other thing that I tend to think about, especially with SBOMs from that leadership level, is encouraging them and executives and in-house counsel to really view software security as really part of the broader sort of enterprise risk management plan. This is something that they talk about on an annual basis. It's something that's exercised. It's something that's tested and probed. And as Maria was saying, I mean, you have to put some of these processes in place and continue to test them, audit them, and validate. Like if you look at broader risk management plans across organizations, that's sort of the muscle memory that's built up sort of institutionally to address these. So looking at this issue as part of that broader enterprise risk management plan, I think is going to sort of get that visibility and sort of buy-in at an institutional level to really start balancing those relatively interests. So we can remain nimble and we can develop and innovate, but also we can sort of understand our risk and where our vulnerabilities are.
That's really helpful. And maybe picking up on the comment about auditing, I mean, when you audit, you sort of, obviously it's helpful to have, clear standards, to audit against. I mean, Aaron, you've talked about the BSA framework. We've got, more frameworks from the government now, but I think we made some mention to sort of international standards. And I'm just kind of curious, are there international standards, or are there obvious yardsticks that make auditing fairly easy in this space, or simpler in this space, or are there other yardsticks you'd point to as part of that oversight, governance, auditing framework?
I mean, I think there are helpful ISO standards, but I think most importantly, having internationally agreed upon or respected standards for secure development, secure capability, secure lifecycle becomes increasingly important, so that going back to the conversations about SBOM, so that we don't have competing standards in different parts of the world. Having different views about what it means to develop software securely in different places and have them be incompatible is bad for the entire ecosystem. And I think the complexity of it, and going to what Maria and Sam were just talking about, shows why increasingly, not just in tech companies, but in all industries, it's becoming more of a C-suite issue, because the development and then the use of software tools and security in general are business critical now. Whatever the SEC may or may not do on requiring there to be somebody with cyber expertise on the board, it is clearly something that, from a liability perspective, from an enterprise risk management perspective, having a clear directive from the top is becoming just super important.
That's really helpful. I'm going back at we were talking before about the teams and the engagement from the management and I guess the legal department with the teams. Maybe this is to sort of pick up on that. Maria, question for you: are there sort of practical tips? I mean, we sort of talk a lot about something like the legal requirements and sort of the scale of the risk, but to some extent, as a lawyer, sort of having to manage those risks, part of that comes down to the ability to sort of engage effectively with the teams. First of all, am I right about that is a big part of actual effective legal risk management in this context? And then what are, if so, like what are some practical tips for engaging with a software development team?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's absolutely right. I think that, it's a lot of relationship building, because you have to establish trust both ways, right? I think that the development team has to trust that I'm not there to be a barrier, but to kind of facilitate things for them on the long run. And they need to trust also that I'm not questioning their expertise, and vice versa, right? This needs to be a symbiotic relationship and a collaboration. And usually, this is silly, but I get past that by just asking a lot of questions. Like, I don't ask them questions that are strictly tied to the legal issue, but I ask broader questions, because I want them to know that I want to understand the product. I want to understand the challenges that they face, and that I want to establish compliance in such a way that doesn't harm them and doesn't make things more difficult for them. But like, we all want to get to a place of yes. So it's about establishing empathy and establishing my position of respecting what it is that they're doing. It's asking a lot of questions and treating it as an opportunity for education for me. Very selfishly, I learn a lot from them, and I think that in a way that works towards forging this relationship, and you know, establishing a good working relationship with them, because it is crucial.
That's really, yeah, it's really helpful. Great practical tips. I mean, maybe picking up on a point that Aaron made. I mean, Maria, you're talking, as we talked about, that you're talking about sort of working some really state-of-the-art issues, and with the very developed and mature processes. I think there are companies that have either less mature processes, and they're software companies, or, to Aaron, you were saying that this isn't just an issue for, quote unquote tech companies. There are lots of companies that develop the software, and I know I don't want to put you too much on the spot, because I know that that's, BSA is focused on, the tech companies that do create sort of the most sophisticated enterprise software. But are there lessons that can be learned by, whether it's a bank or, so you name it, there are lots of companies that produce a lot of software with respect to software security, and what are some resources that they should be looking at, as they think about these types of questions in the context of their businesses?
So I think when we think about companies that are not seen as tech companies, they can kind of fit into at least two categories. One, the financial services sector. So a lot of financial services companies are developing a lot of their own software, probably not all of it, and they'll rely on companies here and BSA members, but they're developing a lot. And so they need to both think about how are we doing what Maria was just talking about, and making sure that we have secure development practices, but also from the vendors that are selling us software that we're then implementing, how do we make sure that that we're purchasing the right software. And then you have the companies that are going through digital transformation, not developing their own software, but increasingly using software from other vendors. And one of the things that I think is really helpful about a NIST framework, our framework, but whatever standard you want to use, is the ability to communicate back and forth with purchasing officers that are not always thinking about software, but have to now, because that's the way their company is growing, and making sure that they can feel confident that the company that they're purchasing from has, for instance, Maria's processes in place in order to make sure that the way the software is developed and deployed is as safe and secure as possible.
We're talking about some of these other contexts. I mean, maybe Maria, I'll start with you. I mean, is that Aveva makes industrial software? Is there anything that's sort of distinctive about industrial software per se, and the sort of the way that you think about software security? Obviously, the risk profile of the software may be different based on its uses, rather than software that's in a kid's toy. But is there anything particularly specific or distinctive about industrial software security?
Yeah, it's a great question. I was thinking about it, and I think that what makes it in a way challenging is the need for interoperability with so many different standards, right? So a lot of times with industrial software, you're talking about interoperating with massive control systems, right? Massive control systems that have been distributed in a set it and forget it manner. So the control system itself, is the OS being updated? Maybe, I don't know. I don't know how often. I don't know how secure that's going to be. So then trying to be agile, be fast, be secure, but also understanding that we're going to be connecting with some things that are maybe not as up to date. Like that does present a challenge when you're talking about on-prem software that's going to connect to something that is maybe not as new. And it's something that we grapple with every day, which I think is unique and maybe not as relevant in the consumer space.
Interesting. Sam, do you have any? I know you Palo Alto has its specific product set, but you participate in sort of think about lots of these policy issues that cut across segments. Are there any sort of insights you have into maybe consumer products or IT products or other types of products where there may be distinctive or commonalities in terms of how to think about software security?
Yeah, I think, you know, in those other contexts with software security, you look at sort of different complexities of the ecosystem. So consumer software that's being deployed, you know, there's sort of a difference in sort of the utility, both from a front end and a back end. You know, one of the other areas in context that I think that's been widely recognized, especially sort of in the policy discussions, is IoT. Sort of this Internet of Things. And I mean, if you just look at sort of the simple structure, the attack surface area is much broader when you're talking about IoT. And then there's sort of software dependencies that chain back from sort of the individual device, the security that's put into the device itself, to the cloud computing infrastructure that those devices ride on. And all of a sudden, sort of the chaining of those obligations become, you know, rather more difficult, which is why, like, even going back to the last administration, you know, there were efforts in sort of securing IoT space. There was the IoT sort of Security Act that was put in place to sort of address some of these issues, in a recognition that those attack vectors are sort of different, highly complex. And, you know, like we talked about at the top of the session with regard to this being an issue of complexity and pressing need, I think this is, you know, those other contexts are sort of, it really do help exemplify that's this problem in software security in this issue area is sort of both of those. And that's like an IoT is sort of a good use case example of how the more complex and how varied the ecosystem can get, all of a sudden software dependencies become way more complex to sort of narrow down and to identify, and then to develop the policies and procedures to be able to sort of develop on top of that.
That's great. So we're coming up on time. I'm going to ask everyone for sort of like one last takeaway or final thought, if there's anything they have that we haven't covered. Before we do, one quick question, maybe I'll pose this to Aaron. You know, we've talked a lot today about software development. I think, Aaron, you teed up at the beginning, so there's the development and there's the maintenance of software as well. We haven't talked as much about vulnerability management, you know, vulnerability disclosure, sort of that suite of issues. You know, do you see that set of issues as relatively well settled now, and expectations around that relatively well settled, or do you think there's going to be, you know, significant movement on that topic as well, you know, in the coming years?
I think we're going to continue to see significant movement on that, and I think that examples like Log4j and the reaction from policymakers, the White House held several meetings and so on, shows that there's going to be continuing pressure, and education of policymakers becomes really important there, because it's one thing to be able to develop a patch that that would solve whatever the vulnerability, the exploitable vulnerability is. It's another thing to get customers to adopt and implement that patch, and determining when and who should be responsible is something that it's important for policymakers to understand how the ecosystem works, so that cybersecurity is a team sport. Sorry for using that metaphor. We almost got through the whole time without it. But it does require everybody to be participating, and it's important for policymakers to understand the different layers.
That makes sense. All right, well, this has been an amazing session. Before we close, maybe I'll just turn to each of you for any sort of final thoughts, or something we missed, any topics that we missed, or anything you particularly want to highlight. Maria, maybe if it's okay, I'll start with you.
Yeah, no, I think that I just wanted to reiterate that this whole idea that this is coming at us from the federal government, and even though, for example, you know, my company is not regulated, like we're not subject to this directly, but it's coming. Like, I think that all of us in the software space have to be prepared to deal with these things, and I think it's important to look at it as it's not all negative, right? There are definite benefits to a lot of the things that are coming down at us. So, you know, it's not all negative. I think a lot of it is going to help us all in the long term.
Right, great. I love the optimism. Sam, what your final thoughts?
Yeah, I think the one thing, and, you know, if there were other tips that sort of I could, for in-house counsel or lawyers in some of these companies, the other thing that I would sort of tip their hat to is keep an eye on the international space with regard to this. Aaron's sort of picked up some of those threads too, especially as sort of US policy development has been sort of a train moving forward. The international space, I think, is just as active. You know, there's some really discrete efforts to sort of look at software security directly. And there's also sort of concurrent efforts, like with everything from like IoT bills and, you know, product liability and the Cyber Resilience Act that all sort of touch around a lot of these issues, because there's so many subcomponents to software security. I think that's another important area to sort of keep your eye on, so you can sort of better understand where the policy conversations are going. So I think that's an important aspect to keep in mind.
Yeah, it's a great thing to flag. Aaron, final words?
Just very quickly, I think elevating best practices and harmonizing them internationally and within governments is essential.
Awesome. Well, that's a great priority for us all to, you know, help advocate for going forward. But first of all, thank you very much. I mean, Aaron, Sam, Maria, this was a fantastic session. Really appreciated you sharing your expertise with everyone and your insights. So thank you very much for taking the time. And thank you to everyone who's listened in. We really appreciate your time as well, and hope you have a great rest of Cybersecurity Awareness Month. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.